like to the extent that we find some of this thought attractive, and then, one learns, recognizes whatever, that, one of the great thinkers of this kind of thought was a card-carrying Nazi, and a thoroughgoing anti-Semite. Not to immediately just turn our backs on the thought, because firstly, it's an ancient form of thought, which again is neither here nor there in terms of its value. But it doesn't belong to that person, but also it becomes very important to try and understand the associations between this kind of thinking and that, just an abhorrent real world outcome. And it, like, how can someone who seems to have such highly differentiated thought and to be thinking, very similar things to Whitehead in a lot of ways, you can say, right? How can someone who's having that kind of thought end up in the place that Heidegger did in terms of, personal beliefs and personal actions? And it is quite important for us to try and understand that, to the extent that we want to think similar thoughts.
More important to study Heidegger than it otherwise even would be, because of this particular connection. So I don't agree with those who would say, oh, we shouldn't study Heidegger because of this, shadow dimension, or this Nazi stain on his thought. I think it means it's all the more important to study Heidegger.
And similarly, boycotting vitalism, or boycotting, narrative, boycotting mythology, all of that.
Well, I just like to remind people, like, a great example of how, a more analytical mode of thought that you might think would prevent you from falling prey to fascism or whatever, the darker side of romanticism. Like, look at Frege. He was a Nazi apologist too. I mean, he was defending a fascist view of the proper way to organize Germany, even though he was also one of the initiators of the Logicist project and all of that. And so even the most analytic thinkers can succumb to this. It's not just a function of these romantics trying to recover a connection to the mythic dimension of our souls or whatever.
And of course, the argument that the romantics would make, or Heidegger would make, is that, of course, the analytic types would be the first to do this, because their whole thought world is predicated on the grasping and on the projective violation of autonomy by trying to get beings, entities, objects to be neat and tidy and to fit into little categorical, conceptually defined boxes. And that's the kind of violence that Sherman is talking about here. Yeah. Okay, so to get onto that sort of topic, and the topic of sort of ownership, I suppose, in Augustine's words, God is more intimate to me than I am to myself. And how should we think about that? It's a local principle, a very context-dependent set of circumstances, and it globalizes in the sense that it contributes, we might say, to a kind of global telos of everything that is. But that global telos is not really fundamentally oriented. It is in the sense of the one. It's just a pure togetherness. So there's a way this local relational context-specific local order and local kinesis proliferates to create a kind of like the image of, or the appearance of, a global telos. But if energeia comes first, that, strictly speaking, is emergent. So there isn't a global telos at the level of principle, right?
Yeah. No, I'm happy with all of that. As the creative advance unfolds, the eternal is enriched by what occurs, and so there's a feeding back onto it, and so it's always that primordial envisagement is always being
it's a drifting non-equilibrium steady state for the whole cosmos, essentially, right? We talked about it a lot of times as the attractor, and I mean that it kind of works, but the predefinite thing, as opposed to the kind of flux of tensions, this topological vision where you do have a kind of energetic landscape. Again, it's not actually energetic, but the analogy, you have a landscape that things can flow across, which is biasing. There are distributions, etc., but there aren't definite objects that are predefined. Like what the actualization is the coming into, like, is the definite defining, determining process, and that happens in a radically in a radically context dependent mode. Like the process of actualization is the coming into togetherness, like the coming into a particular epoch defined by, again, nested. Oh, I keep doing this hierarchy, nested, whatever. But they're nested temporal scales, right? So it's the coming into being, the process of actualization, that results in definiteness. Agents of some degree of sophistication or complexity is not itself primordial. The primordial thing is more about continuity and a lack of pre-definiteness. That's what I want, because that's the more anarchic view, and that's the more impoverished view, basically, because I worry too much about where's that definiteness coming from. Like when we're trying to talk about the attractor and its formation, we're always going to be in some sort of poetic whatever mode. Speculative.
I think of Eckhart's saying, "I pray that God rid me of God. I pray God to rid me of God." And there's a sense in which, again, the groundlessness at the core of the soul is precisely the nothingness of the one beyond being. And so, we have to be willing to face the anxiety which arises when we touch that anarchic abyss. And, Heidegger's term about appropriating that, making that our own, it's not even something that we can make our own. It's like each of us has our own unique relationship with that. And so a synonym for God, as far as I'm concerned, in the deepest sense of what that term should mean, would be I. And then it's, obviously you want to avoid some kind of crass like messiah complex, but at the same time, no one else can refer to me with that pronoun. And so there's something about that mystical paradox of the one within that I think can really help provoke a renewal of our relationship to the mystery of existence.
Yeah.